Good morning, everyone. Critical minerals rush. Wow. I don't think in 3 hours, including last night, I've heard the term critical minerals mentioned as much as here, even at a mining conference. It's pretty amazing. We have a tremendous panel that will be talking today about critical minerals. The way we're going to do it is have a discussion, actually, and I'll start with some framing remarks. But just want to introduce the panelists. So we have Abigail Hunter on my left, Executive Director, Centre for Critical Minerals Strategy at SAFE, based in DC. Rafe Sully at the end, CEO of Lilac Solutions, one of the leading DLE, direct lithium extraction companies based here in the US. Morgan Bazilian, Director of the Payne Institute, Colorado School of Mines, who we share a partnership with at the Future Minerals Forum, which is great. And then Vinay, who's looking very sharp today, and wearing socks, if you were here last night. Senior Advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Industry and Analysis at, Senior Advisor, so Risk, Global Infrastructure and Investment at the State Department. So welcome. So let's baseline what we mean by critical minerals, right? So, I mean, the reason we're all kind of obsessed about critical minerals is we're actually moving away from a fossil fuel-based system to a minerals-based system. Okay, and it's creating an unprecedented demand rush, actually, for mineral production and supply between now and 2035 through 2050. And I talk about the top 10 headwinds that supply is facing that will lead us to a minerals famine, actually. And I think it's important to understand all critical minerals aren't created equally. So I think using the term critical minerals is actually dangerous for us, because every mineral has its own characteristics, its own challenges, jurisdictions, different companies dominating the supply chain, and we need a strategy that's different for each mineral, to be honest. And the main ones I talk about are copper, nickel, lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements. The other 50, I think, minerals are important, but not as important as those. And interestingly, copper is not on the USGS's critical minerals list, and it is the metal of electricity. It's the only metal that spans EVs, batteries, solar, wind, and exponentially more copper needed than with traditional energy sources. So I just want to talk about why is this a challenge? So first, I think a challenge for the US government. This could be the only sector where US companies don't dominate. Of the 30 largest mining companies, 3 are American. Okay, one's 28th, one's a gold miner, and then there's Freeport. Okay, the most major miners are Anglo-Australian and Brazilian and Chilean, and a couple of Chinese companies in there, and actually more Russian than Chinese mining companies in the top 30, which in itself I think creates interesting challenges from a policy perspective, which we'll jump into. So some of the big headwinds that I think, I won't go through all 10, trust me, is resource nationalism is on the rise. Those countries that have resource endowments are trying to express it in different ways. So there's increased rent extraction. So even in countries like Australia, they arbitrarily renegotiate royalty and tax agreements, long-term agreements, to extract greater rent. Australia, Senegal just announced renegotiations, Zambia, every country, more rent extraction. Another way of doing it is through nationalizing the industry. So Mexico pushed a cartel of Bolivia, Mexico, Argentina, and Chile to do semi-nationalization of their lithium industries, which Chile has announced and will do and upset a few companies in that. And lastly is just an outright ban on certain activities, which is kind of Indonesia banning the export of nickel, forcing processing to happen in their country. So these are all kind of resource nationalism, and leads to kind of where a lot of these countries want to go, which is, and this is African countries, Latin American countries, I want to develop my resource endowment to grow the prosperity of my country. This is not a message we articulate, that we want to support them in that effort, to be honest. Okay, and to do that, they want to maintain or retain more and more of the value of mining and shift away from this extract and ship model that has prevailed the industry, and they call it extract, ship, and build. And there's challenges market-wise, capital-wise, etc., infrastructure in each of these countries. Another one is capital deficit. And, the US government throws money around, but it may not throw it around in the right places. So in copper, it's not there's a lack of capital. It's the big mining companies that dominate copper just don't want to invest in big new mines. They're just not interested. They have the money. They're not going to build big new mines. Mike Henry talks about $250 billion need to be invested in growth for copper supply between now and 2030, and only $40 billion has been committed. because they don't want to do it. There's too high a risk to building these massive copper mines if the resources existed. Lithium's another one. There's actually a drought. Rafe's going to talk about that, is there is no capital for lithium miners, because as soon as the price collapses, everybody has a mad scramble and shuts down, so disconnect with long term. And we won't get into it in a big way, but the indigenous reframe, First Nations, Native Americans, indigenous communities all around the world are reframing how mining relates to them, how the benefits flow to them, how it helps grow social and economic prosperity for their communities beyond the life of mine. Very complex. Just spoke at the First Nations conference in Canada, and I can only say the gap is getting bigger between government and companies. And maybe it's not getting bigger, maybe it's just becoming more apparent as Indigenous people are getting much more sophisticated and finding their voice. So before I hand over to Abby with a question, is I think some of the big questions, and have been touched on, how do companies and governments that operate in a free market world compete with countries that are with state-directed or influenced market shaping? Nickel's the poster child. Okay, Indonesia, which is controlled by China, the mining, flooded the market with nickel, collapsed the price. Essentially, the New Caledonian nickel industry, 2 mines shut. The Australian nickel industry will be shut down, already 3 bankruptcies and closures. BHP, I believe, with no inside knowledge, will probably shut its nickel operations because they're just massively unprofitable. That's what I call market shaping activities, so they'll dominate that. Another one is the US government lacks, despite everything we've heard, and I think Maureen mentioned we need a national strategy. We lack a coherent and unified and holistic strategy domestically and globally for the development of minerals. We absolutely do. And examples of this is, I don't know what the answer is, MSP, if you read the site, it's heavily ESG related. It doesn't talk about affordable, adequate, secure supply of minerals. It's all ESG. Western mining companies do not need to be lectured about how to do ESG. I mean, they're on it. So I think that's another thing. And we essentially have a conflicted administration. So we do talk about investment on peripheral mining activities and processing, but we're essentially an anti-mining administration. They pulled the permit on Resolution Copper in Arizona, which would supply 30% of US copper. And that's notwithstanding the, I think, valid claims the 19 Apache tribes have there, which are taken through court. Different situation. And we're about to announce, or have announced, that we're not approving an access road into Alaska for another major copper mine. So when it comes to big mines, we're not interested. We just shut it down. So I think that's probably, and I don't know what the answer to that is. We'll dive into that. And then last, Saudi Arabia. It has a demonstrated vision 2030 to say it wants to be as dominant in minerals energy system as it is in fossil. It's part of Vision 2030, and it's not Saudi Arabia production. They've embraced the concept of a super region, and they put their arms around all of Africa, Central Asia, and the Middle East. So are they a partner or a competitor? And recent news about the new strategic alliance between Saudi Arabia and US may provide the answer for that, but we'll see. So those are kind of some of the initial framing remarks. So it's complicated, and I hope you take away one insight, one learning that'll help you kind of think about policy, strategy, collaborations needed to get this ball moved down the field. Abigail, over to you. Within this kind of complexity that we have, what do we need to do and think about kind of the adequate, affordable, secure supply, putting ESG, the responsible part, on the sideline just for a moment?
First, thank you for all of that. I feel like you just described all the things that haunt my nightmares about the trade-offs and tensions that exist in the mineral space, and quite succinctly. Thanks to Silverado for having me here today and bringing together this great panel. Except for Rafe, I haven't met these gentlemen before, but I've read things they've written, I've heard of them, so it's really an honor to be on stage with you all. I think maybe, you said just end with the ESG and focus more on the, adequate and supply, but maybe I'll start in inverse and back into it. But I was reading in preparation for my boss's trip to Milken next week some of these trends in financing and the demand of the ESG side of these equations on companies, and Stacey alluded to it on the last panel as well, and the fact that we have these requirements on these companies but not necessarily honing in on a premium that they would get or trying to work with the end consumers to be able to reward this behavior is something that in the developed world I think we need to really hone in on. And I can't agree with you more. We're in partnership, SAFE is, with the Mineral Security Partnership via the state State Department, and I've seen panels where we have talked about government officials kind of talking about the importance of these standards, and they're sitting next to almost seemingly lecturing the companies that are adhering to them and trying to really hard and are actually becoming non-competitive as a result. So that tension is very apparent. In the lower income context where these resource-rich countries want to have the ability to go downstream to have increased value capture, local content creation, and are doing so by potentially having those export restrictions, increased rents, as you alluded to. I was testifying yesterday to USITC, and that was the first question I got: is how do we deal with this rise of kind of control of materials to avoid a resource curse on their end? And I think it's quite complex, but that doesn't necessarily solve the problem at hand. Right? We need to be able to work with these governments, and the new Mineral Security Partnership Forum, the part of which that the European Commission is leading, is trying to do just that, saying, hey, export restrictions are not necessarily going to result in a development of these supply chains here. A, B, you're able to actually capture more profit in the upstream segments of these supply chains, and we need to kind of think about governance principles that allow those communities to benefit from those higher profits, maybe moving a little bit away from the World Bank model that existed previously on this and thinking creatively about putting those investments back into the surrounding infrastructure that will further justify investments downstream that need, secure and affordable and reliable sources of electricity that fuel very, very highly advanced manufacturing processing of these materials. When we were in Lusaka and Kinshasa last year, the hotels kept on losing electricity as we were talking about this topic, which is quite exemplary of the challenge at hand. And then the surrounding actual transportation infrastructure to move these goods around, as well as the ability to kind of consolidate demand within the region as you move slowly downstream to be able to actually justify the 4 to 6 gigawatts that are needed to put a gigafactory in a region, right? So all of that needs to kind of come together hand in hand with those countries, and so that plays to the equitable, and hopefully that will lead us to the increased amount of supply access, that's more competitive as we elbow out China in these highly concentrated supply chains.
Right. Thanks, Abigail. That's a pretty good, concise answer. Opens up a lot of questions too, which we'll get to. Rafe, I'll switch to you at the end. You're probably the leading, I'll say, direct lithium extraction company here in the US. With the collapse of the lithium price and the issue around, extraction of lithium is predominant in Australia, mainly Chile, some of the Latin American countries are growing, and 90% of lithium processing, not the other minerals, only lithium, not critical minerals, is done in China, and capital's not really available. I mean, how do you think about all this? And, we need lithium, but there seems to be reaction to the collapse in market price.
Yeah, so I'm very worried, Peter, is the answer.
Thank you.
Just as context, if you think about lithium, 5 years ago, there was 300,000 tonnes produced globally. Mm-hmm. Today, there's 1 million tonnes, so it's gone up 3x in 5 years. Over the next 5 years, it needs to get to 3 million tonnes. That's reasonably conservative. Could be a lot more than that. And it's hard to see how you could ever do that just from the US alone. And so the couple of thoughts I have is you have to, the US government has to develop some partnerships with non-Chinese players outside of the US. It's hard to see how you could get anywhere near that lithium production without getting lithium out of the ground in Argentina, okay, and Chile, and probably Bolivia as well. And yet we don't have a free trade agreement with Argentina or Bolivia. We do with Chile, and so I think if we think about trying to solve these problems by ourselves, we're going to fail. We need to think about influence a broader set of countries that we need to be a part of a coalition, right? Yeah. If we withdraw, and let me just give you, we've been involved in the development of 4 brine lithium extraction projects in Argentina. One of them as a partner, technology partner. 3 of them we're developing ourselves. And with the recent price collapse, and I'll come to the reasons for that recently, the only people interested at the moment in taking those developments further are Chinese. Okay? Everyone else has backed away. Yeah. And I think there's a really very stark contrast there with the type of time frame that Western investors look at these problems versus the competition. Yeah. Okay. Now, if you look at the price, the why price collapse, you have to say, well, what, with all of this remarkable growth in demand for lithium, what happened in the last 12 months? And the answer is high cost production came online and provided a temporary oversupply. Okay, and where did that high cost production come online? Well, not in Africa / China. Should it be there? From an economic perspective, it shouldn't be. The cost of production that caused the oversupply is well over $20 a tonne, or $20,000 a tonne to produce, and prices have collapsed into $12 and $15,000. So, what I'm seeing there is not dissimilar from what I think we would have seen a few years back with rare earths, and the oversupply causing lack of investment in Western countries, and then the consolidation of that processing in China. And I'm concerned that we will see a repeat of that across the other critical minerals.
Great. Thanks, Rafe. That's a good summary. And again, I think a key point there is, China, because it takes a much longer-term interest, kind of an empire strategy approach. They're always the buyer of last resort when prices collapse. We see that time and time again. Morgan, Saudi Arabia. So, you've spent time there as well as I have. So their super region concept, they actually address a lot of the issues that Abigail was talking about in their message to African ministers, which they seem to be receptive to, the Africans and the Central Asian countries. How should we be thinking about Saudi Arabia? What are they doing? Maybe you can unpack that a little for the audience and then some insights there.
Sure. First, thanks very much for having me to the Silverado team. I'm grateful to be here with this extraordinary group. I'm just back from a World Economic Forum event in Riyadh, and so it was a delight to come to a meeting in a winery. A lot of what we're talking about here, the last point has to do with the markets that these things are traded. So as you said, they're not homogeneous markets. They have very different supply chains. The markets are essentially a joke. So a lot of us that came into this space from the energy security, in my case, or energy space, we try to make analogies to oil and gas, and anyone in this room could tell me the price of crude in Dubai in 3 seconds. You can't do that for lithium. You'd have to, or let alone graphite or something else. You'd have to ask a million questions about currency and price discovery and transparency and liquidity. And at the forum in Riyadh, we just released a little essay for them on derivatives markets for some of these things, which are essentially non-existent or very thin and not very useful. And so I think, the market development piece is certainly one. This is not a new area. So the Colorado School of Mines has been working on, so I'm a professor at a small university in Colorado. It's a public research university. We just do science and technology. There's people, I've been there for 5 years and I moved from the World Bank, and so my view is slightly different. But there's been people at the School of Mines working on these issues for a very long time. And now it's really exciting to see the area take priority. So there's obviously Silverado's interested, and SAFE has a program, and CSIS has a program, and everybody has a program. And I was just on another call with Georgetown is getting into it, et cetera. It's not a new area. And so we do have to draw on analogies from development and markets and energy markets. And that's what Saudi is doing. And so, when Saudi Arabia says they're going to get into something, they don't do it like the United States does. They've already invested $15 billion, and they did it in a very smart way, which is they looked around, took some nice companies, and either took them over or just invested as junior partners. I mean, it's a very good, in my opinion, way to look at it. But when we think of energy security, and this also has to do with Saudi Arabia, is how did we used to think about energy security? Well, we used to think about it as in the United States as far as the Carter Doctrine, right, in 1970s. And that's sort of the first time also we actually had a critical minerals list in the United States in the 70s, even though we've worked on it for a long time. It's the origins of the Defense Production Act, et cetera. But when you think of energy security and your point about what is critical and what's not critical, look, we still do criticality. The methodology for criticality is very simplistic. It essentially says, where do we get the stuff and how much? So it's a supply side focus. That's precisely how we used to look at energy security. We said, we get the stuff from Saudi Arabia, it comes through the Strait of Hormuz, we will put the US Navy's 5th Fleet at the Strait of Hormuz, and that's how we deal with security. That's today how we're currently calculating what's critical. So we have a USGS list, and then confusingly, we also have a US DOE list. And then we have politics. I want to be on the list because of tax credits, et cetera. Saudi Arabia doesn't have to deal with that kind of complexity. Neither does China. Yeah. And so, a few thoughts there. It's all connected, and we really do, while it's exciting that critical minerals are a priority now, they're a political priority. The reason we're talking about them now is because of China, period. It's not because of demand for EVs or because of demand for copper and tungsten for ammunition. It's because of China. In the United States, that's why. And so I think we should keep all of those things in mind, that there are clues from the past to guide us on these things. This is, again, I hate to be the guy who says this, but let's not reinvent the wheel. I can't believe I just said that. Thank you.
Thanks, Morgan, you did. And I understand being happy to be in a vineyard after a week in Saudi. So that's a perfect lead-in for Vinay. So Vinay, how do we, obviously I think you can't, as I call it, kneecap China in this whole thing, because they're just too big a user of minerals, customer, investor. So it's really, how does the US use all of the tools available to it in a coherent manner, whether it's diplomacy, commerce, loans, everything, to become the preferred partner for these countries that are trying to develop their resources?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And exactly that. I don't think you can kneecap China, but we also have to be careful that we don't also copy the methods that China's used. I think it would undermine our own sense of innovation, the innovative work that your company is doing, and the continued innovation even in this sector. The dominance in this sector started a decade ago, where the state in China did sort of vertically integrate, did have the capital capacity to guarantee offtake for something that was sort of fragmented, whether it's rare earths or other critical minerals. And so when we look around the world in our own industrial policy, and this is not my area of expertise, I think as we look forward, Maureen described a lot of areas where we need to work, and that's probably the smart way to do it. What we have to make sure is that we don't just erect more tariffs or try and keep sort of China out. We're not a unipolar world or a bipolar world in that way. And that's where, at least for us, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment is something Raif was saying. We need to work with partner countries, and that's in the entire ecosystem. So for us, it's how do we take the limited public money we have? How do we bring American finance and Western finance to certain markets to develop the sector? So for critical minerals, it may be specific transactions, or it may be also building the infrastructure in that country for rail, for common gauge across 3 countries in Zambia, DRC, and Angola, and making sure it's open access, that it's not just one mining company that has access to it. And that the way to build resiliency is through diversity of these partners. It means that in Angola, invests about $1 billion of EXIM money, very low cost for solar supply, and make sure that they have the power that they need for the industrialization, and really meet some of these countries at their resource nationalism goals. If they say they want to process it in country, it's something that's understandable. And so how do you help facilitate that? Because that codependency is what will give you strength in terms of single market domination. So I think that's what we're focused on. We're also working with OEMs, have some colleagues here. How do we help them secure mineral supply as well? Rare earths is especially, I think, challenging, difficult, as every expert here would know, because the applications are so varied. So it's hard to go from what you mine to sort of the end product, given there's so many different applications. I will say your point on ESG is an interesting one, that there may be some perception about finger wagging, but I would go to what Abigail said as well, that whether it's ESG or even greenifying some mining operations, it is a differentiator, and it can create its own market barrier if you accentuate that. And we know it's an important part of our sort of climate future. So how can we use cheap concessional money to help mining companies around the world greenify their operations? Or how do we make a common standard? That does give you strength, especially if you think about some of the interconnectedness around carbon taxes and that sort of thing. That will give you a leading edge in the future.
And one comment on that, I wasn't diminishing ESG as a differentiator, because I think companies like BHP, Rio use that as a differentiator. What I was suggesting is it doesn't need the government then to also double down on that and lecture everybody, because they're already doing it, to Abigail's point, so they don't need finger wagging. And I've heard African ministers say, we're sick of the hypocrisy of the West, we don't like being lectured, we want to develop our resources. in a way that's appropriate for our country. So, I mean, there's a tension in the system, and it's a challenge to get it right. So let's give a counter narrative. I'll be interested to just throw this one out here. So the IRA Act, gives a lot of incentives. It's very jobs creation focused in the US. So let's flip to Australia. So Australia, the nickel industry, if the nickel industry shuts down, it undermines their critical minerals federal government strategy. They are struggling as a high-cost country, energy, labour, to bring in the downstream processing for lithium, etc. So it all goes to China. But the US government, just because of our motivation and politics, is we're not inclined to actually invest in Australia in a way, because the Australian federal government doesn't have the wherewithal to underpin industry. So as a Five Eyes country, which DOD has a lot of fast-track things for Australia, because it's Five Eyes, we don't in the rest of the government. So we're watching Australia actually just continue its extract ship model. And I don't think they're going to be able to build the kind of downstream infrastructure they would wish without support from the US, which I don't think we're open to, because it doesn't create jobs in Australia, in the US. So who wants to tackle that one? Abigail, you look like you're ready.
I have so many thoughts. So we've spent a ton of time at SAFE thinking about the nickel pickle, as it were, which I definitely stole from an article headline, and I forgive me for not knowing the byline. But I think that the important thing here is, because you're making such a strong point about the fact that they need investment to help them get to the further downstream elements where then we can buy it. And I was heard, and I was emailing around trying to figure out if this was true, and I see some OEMs in the room, so maybe they can tell me if it's true after this, that the US is then trying to now point our downstream consumers, these OEMs, to then have to buy the Australian nickel. How can we do that right, in a legal way, in a codified fashion? And that's not really solving the problem, because as you noted, they don't actually get to the nickel sulfate, the battery grade nickel that then they would buy, the OEMs would buy. There's this huge gap in the supply chain that Australia doesn't yet have, and we don't have, right? So we can't buy the precursor to nickel sulfate and then further process it yet in the United States. We're not there yet. So we have this really misalignment with time and meeting these goals, and then putting undue pressure on the downstream companies that are really struggling to compete right now against China, because they're producing really, really low-cost vehicles, benefiting from the same problematic and low-cost environment across the nickel supply chain. So that's the first point. I would say that our export-import bank is only really an export bank right now, and even our colleagues in the Department of Commerce have a real export mandate to them, and so we should really start to think about whether or not we can utilize these tools from an import fashion as well, and then do that in coordination with countries, and those are the ideas behind the Mineral Security Partnership and PGI. So that's another aspect to this. I would also say, going back to what seems to be the larger thematic of this panel around the higher standards, what's happening in Indonesia is, one, a desire to be able to produce these things on the archipelago and then go further and further downstream, and they are kind of the red herring in terms of success in doing that, right? They wanted to essentially have that refining capacity right around the time that China had already built 1 million smelters, and then but they forced them to build them there, and so now you have major refining capacity in Indonesia. Now they're going even further with HPAL, which is a precursor for nickel sulfate, and there is some MHP, which is another part of the way to get to nickel sulfate that's higher, has higher environmental protections, less emissions, and then HPAL has a lot more waste affiliated with it, so you have all these tailings stacking up, and then they're being dumped in the ocean illegally. And so Indonesia wants the desire to be able to be IRA compliant, and then we have this opportunity to negotiate to get them to a place where maybe they could be, right? It's not just this binary jurisdiction-only consideration. You can actually have a conversation and potentially have compliant streams of materials. We can get creative of how we can actually get Indonesia to move to actually have permitting processes. Right now it's a box check from a government official. It is not the same level of permitting requirements that we have in the United States and other Western countries, and then actually have them enforce their existing regulations, like the illegal fashion in which they're dumping the tailings into the ocean, right? And then rewarding good players all the while that are doing as much as they can with natural gas, increasingly other renewable energy sources. And so those are kind of my thoughts on simultaneously supporting nickel production in Australia over maybe a medium-term horizon, and then trying to get existing producers to meet our standards in the shorter-term horizon, because the OEMs have to meet these goals now. We have to meet these goals now. There's an urgency to this.
So anybody else want to dive into that? Morgan, do you want to?
I don't think Australia is the important piece of that discussion.
Just to throw it out as an example.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, but I would say Canada is.
Yeah.
So Canada operates in Indonesia and has for a very long time. Canada produces nickel chemicals that come into the United States, something like 50% of our needs. So I mean, sure, I guess you have to think about this in terms of its framing. So we had a great presentation to start off the day about that looked at photovoltaics and then batteries and stuff. And about over 20 years ago, I finished my PhD on thermal physics, photovoltaics in Australia, and the person working next to me was Dr. Xi, who then started the modern photovoltaic industry in China. And the couple things to say are that the graphs that you showed went back a certain way. If you're as old as I am, we'd like to see it go back further. And back further was Germany and Japan doing feed-in tariffs, and the United States doing R&D. And then, the question I always get asked is, oh, well, they're dominating the solar industry, and what kind of analogies, or what I think is what kind of analogies for critical minerals, which is your point. And I think it's a really useful set of analogies, more useful in some ways than the traditional oil and gas analogies. And that is, so Dr. Xi and I finished our PhDs around the same time. He then became wildly successful and made a huge impact. I less so. And but is the technology good in China? The solar technology good? Yeah. From a physics perspective, it's excellent. It's as good as anywhere. The quality on the panels anywhere here in the lovely California, any problems? Anyone notice any problems before we started really angsting on China of their solar panels? No. What's that?
They don't last very long now.
Yep.
They don't last as long as US panels.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the physics technology is the same, and the only reason you have those panels on your roof, or the only reason that solar became big, was because China brought the cost down. Period. We did other things, but before we understood these problems, there was no problem. We still get 80% of the material, and it's still coming through no matter what the trade things say, because you can just mix the polysilicon and et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it's interesting in terms of priorities, right? So did we know that there was problems in China with Xinjiang and forced labor? Yes. Have we known it for a long time? Yes. We didn't just discover it, even though it appears like we just discovered it. It became a political priority, and therefore we just discovered it. They've been doing this for other places. Have you ever heard of Tibet or anything? Right? We knew this was happening. And so political prioritization runs everything. And I think that comes back to this critical minerals piece. And it's one, yes, it's a hot topic right now. No, it's not going to stay a hot topic forever. And we have to think about this in a heterogeneous way across different ways, and not rely on the politically most appealing phrase in America, which is we have to dominate this.
Yeah, that's a perfect lead-in. So Vinay first, and then Warren Rafe. I'm going to ask you about green premium, so think. So Vinay, you mentioned something interesting last night around China, how we need to think about it. So if you look at this affordable, adequate, secure part, there's actually a tension in the system, because China, just because of its size, manufacturing prowess, their panels may not be as good, but they have an affordable and adequate supply of a lot of things we need. But it creates potentially a security risk for the US and the West, because they could use it as a choke point at some point as leverage, right? So how do we balance those two things? Versus, what Morgan says, we want to dominate everything. Is that really feasible? But how do we mitigate any security risks of China, kind of squeezing on its dominance of something when it wants to? So I'm talking to your diplomatic partner.
Yeah, and I, at the sake of sounding redundant, I would sort of point to, again, resilience through diversity. Maureen talked about the scaffolding. It seems like in some of these sectors, critical maybe minerals less so, some of that scaffolding is falling off in China. It is market forces that are causing some of these prices to come down. Sort of Chinese companies competing against each other, running out of domestic market. In a weird way, in the climate, if you're thinking only from a climate lens, having cheap Chinese products helps you meet your climate goals faster, potentially. But you do have this security concern as well, and I just go back to the same point of making sure your partners can do it as well as you can, rather yourselves. And I think that's the aperture. If we can work on the IRA, build the domestic capacity home, manufacturing, dig up the minerals here, sure, we've got a lot of other priorities as well. How do we make sure the other countries can do it responsibly? How can we support them? How can we help with offtake guarantees? How do we really lower the cost of capital so that they can accelerate their own economies? I mean, the cost of capital is the biggest thing that works against us. We're a victim of our own success. The dollar is the most strongest currency in the world, and that means if you want to borrow dollars to do something in a third world country, you're going to pay a lot more to mine that piece of lithium than you would in the United States, and these countries say that's not fair. So can we use our public monies to sort of lower risk and blend finance and lower the cost so that they can be able
and that leads, and then Morgan, then Rafe. So that leads us into more of a whole of government strategy, I think, for countries, so we can apply not only financial but other capabilities for countries to help them build their resources. Morgan, and then Rafe.
Just a very quick one, just to reinforce what you said, Rafe, on diversity. So in 2008, I wrote a book that no one's read called Analytical Methods for Energy Diversity and Security.
It's go to Amazon #1 now.
Yeah, it's a terrible title.
Exactly.
And unlike Dimitri, I got 0 credit for the second line of that book saying Europe should be wary of relying too heavily on Russian natural gas.
Yes.
But back then, which seems like a long time ago to some people in the room, it was very clear that diversity was a large part of meeting security, and it still is. And in that book, we laid out a lot of mathematics that prove that point, but I think it's worth going back to that thing that we know how to deal with security, and it's usually through different kind of networks and diversity and all the rest of it that we know very well, and we should apply that here.
Absolutely. Rafe, I think one of the things the nickel pickle has displayed, and I agree, ESG and the way we do responsible mining and processing is a competitive advantage. And not so much for country, is that's how you get to social license with communities, because without community consent, you're done. Okay, but what nickel has highlighted, and to the frustration of BHP and Glencore, who have advocated for a green premium on nickel from OEMs, LME, the London Metal Exchange, no green premium. Auto companies, no, we're not paying more for a green premium. So they happily buy Indonesian nickel that we know, anecdotally, not the best. So as you think about, so that's kind of punctured that balloon on green premiums and ESG performance. So how do you think about this? Because you guys are in the epicenter of that, although in lithium, so not nickel. But how do you think about the green premium? How do we get there?
Yeah, okay. So before I answer that, I'm going to go back to the IRA. Okay?
Sure, yeah.
I think the IRA could be transformative, but there are kind of 2 lingering concerns with it. One is the political bipartisanship we see here. How long will it last, or will it be changed? And I think a lot of people are concerned about that, which, if you're trying to make a decision about a 20-year investment, wondering what's going to happen in 4 is very important. Okay? And then the other is, I think it's too narrow. I'm going to go back to the diversity and the partnerships. We need to expand the number of people, the number of countries, the number of projects. We've got some very arbitrary boundaries, national boundaries around whether it applies or doesn't, and we need to get around that so that it's project-based. Who owns the project? How is the project being conducted? Those things are much more important than where it is conducted. Okay. On the green premium, so I mentioned we've been involved in 4 projects in Argentina. We're developing a couple in North America, and we've got 4 or 5 on the go in Europe. If you add all of that production up, it could well be 150,000 tonnes of lithium. And we've been in conversation with all of the car makers about offtake agreements. And you mentioned it, no one's interested in a green premium. Okay, they will not commit to that. It's just not there. And I think that's probably an indication of the maturity of the market. I think if you look for other analogies here where people are willing to pay a green premium for something, it only happens when a market's been a developed market, or when there's a maturity to the market we don't have in lithium and some of the critical minerals. So I think it's possible in the future, but the next 3 to 5 years, no one's going to do it.
Cool.
Can I add something on the IRA?
Yeah, and then I'll warn everyone, we'll do one last takeaway, which I'll start with, and then Abigail, you go.
So just really quickly, I'm super excited to be at a vineyard and not reading the recently released 250 pages from the IRS that cements the final guidance for 30D excluded entities.
Might need a lot of wine.
And then there's
for that.
another accompanying one out of the DOE that finally defines the foreign entities concerned affiliated with the 30D tax credit, and then also with the bipartisan infrastructure law grants. And also to say, we have just gotten to this point now, right? We're 2 years into the IRA, and we're just, right, if my math is right, 2 years in, and we just got this final clarity on guidance. And while we've been waiting for that, and it's extremely complicated, and industry, outreach and engagement is necessary to get to this point, but it's really paralyzed investment. And so now we just got here. We finally have clarity to the extent that people can read all of that legalese in a quick time period to then put investments in. And then even then, we're 2 years into a 10-year tax credit. A lot of these facilities that need to be within IRA compliance streams, including the ones that the bipartisan infrastructure law incentivizes in the United States for midstream and to a certain degree upstream with the new LPO announcement that came out this week. That's not going to immediately be online for us to utilize. And then we have this looming election that could potentially, crack open parts of the Inflation Reduction Act, including these provisions, and change it. And so we're really, not necessarily creating a competitive environment for ourselves. And we need to, maybe apoliticize a lot of it, as Morgan implied, to be able to actually create these secure, resilient, affordable supply chains and make a difference in this challenge.
Yeah. So I'll ask the panelists for each one final takeaway, and as the clock is running down, my final takeaway is we desperately need a aligned, coherent strategy from the US government, and that we do speed. I mean, African ministers have told me, and other people that deal with them, we talk to the US, and after 6 months we get an MOU, and when we talk to China we have a contract done in 3 months. But I think they would prefer the US to be the partner at the table. And last thing, Morgan, your lessons from the past. Iron ore 20 years ago, the Pilbara was producing 100 million tons of iron ore. Today they produce 1 billion tons for China, but back 20 years ago it was all long-term contracts with the Koreans and Japanese. The mining companies said that was destroying value to them, and they went at 100% to a spot market. So mining companies, other than juniors who need money, aren't really interested in long-term contracts, because I've talked to them. Mining companies want premiums, and OEMs want discounts. So, I mean, there's a conflict there. So anyway, that's my final takeaway, lessons from the past. So Rafe, starting down the end and moving up, one final takeaway for the audience.
Look, if we back out of some of these countries where critical minerals are and we have the opportunity to develop them, we create a vacuum, someone else fills that vacuum, that's good for anyone. I think we need to make sure that we can solve this. We want to do it our way. Your point, we don't want to be like some of the other players out there. We do it the right way, but we need to do that with partners. We've got to get a broader coalition together and be more aligned with the partnerships.
Absolutely, Rafe. Thank you, Vinay.
Yeah, to echo the same thing, the one thing about, and this is not my area of expertise, but some people joke that the one thing the Inflation Reduction Act doesn't do is reduce inflation, and that you can end up having fiscal policy and sometimes set up programs that actually make it more expensive. And I think as we take on China and try and be competitive, we have to make sure that we're not doing something that works not against just the American ethos, but against sort of economic benefit. And sometimes the trade-off is when you put these things in place, it will make things expensive in the short term, it will cause inflation, but it might make us competitive in the longer term. And so that's why in the work that I do, it's working with other countries and what we can do there and what we can bring in terms of private finance to build infrastructure and build the ecosystem around this, and always sort of welcome views on thoughts on how we can do that better.
Great, thanks, Vinay. Morgan.
Priorities are everything, and they are political and fickle and ephemeral and highly uncertain. So the constant refrain from companies over the last 200 years has been, give us certainty in policy, and it's never once happened in the United States. So you can stop asking for it. And and that prioritization has implications for how we run foreign policy, for how we think of security, for how we think of geopolitics. And you have to embrace this uncertainty in all of those areas. And if you're not, then your hubris makes the policies you put in place fundamentally myopic.
Thank you, Morgan. Good point. Abigail, last bite.
So I'll build on Morgan's point with with the uncertainty being kind of the stabilizing factor here, and just say maybe a bright light is some of the changes with regards to not only in the United States, but also in France and other countries, putting direct funding into some firms to be able to make these investments on behalf of the government. So like the Development Finance Corporation and TechMet, and France with Infravia. That allows for agility in some of these decisions, alleviating your point, Peter, about the challenges we're seeing in lower income countries that want to be able to have the stability of those decision-making bodies. And it also helps alleviate the cost of capital. That is, I completely agree with Vinay. I talk to investors all the time. That is a huge, huge impediment, if not the biggest impediment, combined with this other side of its coin in pricing instability. And so the ability to take government and its politicized decision-making and its bureaucratic lags out of the equation will help us compete with China, because as China has become extremely centralized in its decision-making with the bureaucratic desires at the top to maintain dominance in these sectors, they are slowing down. So let's try to maybe pivot, and it seems impossible for us to beat them on speed, but that is a different way to go about it, and we are beginning to take a crack at that.
Right. And I'll do one last takeaway because of partnerships. So my nonprofit, we work around the world on resource projects, especially with communities. And one thing I think where the US has an advantage but needs to really play to the strength is what we call the triangle of trust between the governments, regional and national in these countries, the communities and the mining companies. And all good partnerships are built on trust, and trust is only built through deep understanding. When you have Indigenous communities going, I want our values, our Indigenous values integrated into mining projects and into contracts, it's a mind bender for anybody that's not Indigenous. Because what are your values? They're not written. So we have to be a catalyst. I think we can be a catalyst to help build these triangles of trust, which will then, I think, embed ourselves with countries. But that's what builds strong partnerships. Lecturing, not saying we do. And China doesn't do this, and I think, and I will be honest, I think Saudi Arabia is the only one speaking that language to these countries right now. So I think that's an opportunity for us to lean into very much. So please join me in thanking our panelists. Great job, guys.